Lunch after some Carly and Mark, and we're here with Shane Joseph. Shane was on the show a couple years ago with the previous novel, After the Flood.
That's right.
And you got a new one here, Shane, which Natalie is holding up right now, called The Ulysses Man. And maybe let's just get a little background on this new book.
Sure. So this book is pretty much set in, I guess, modern times.
Like today?
Well, like between 1960 and about 2005. So in my lifetime.
Okay.
And it traces the path of an immigrant who leaves his native country, which was then called Ceylon, which is now called Sri Lanka, under some rather trying circumstances, because he's virtually pushed out of his country through various events that take place in his family life. You know, he's faced with insanity, alcoholism. There's the mob involved. There's a lot of things that sort of agitate to push him out. He comes to Canada. He tries to find a home here. He's very successful in business. You know, he starts and ends companies and makes a lot of money and then loses it all. And then, sort of disillusioned with everything, he goes back to Ceylon to see whether, you know, could he make his life back there again. Mm-hmm. And he finds that country has changed. You know, that country is now wrecked with a tsunami. There's a civil war going on.
You can't go back.
Can't go back.
Right?
Yeah, yeah. And so then he comes to the conclusion of where home really is. Mm-hmm. And that's why I call it the Ulysses Man, because it's modeled on the journeys of Ulysses, who was a big influence on this character's life. And at the same time, you know, Ulysses himself was traveling for years, trying to get back home from the wars, right? And ultimately, when he got home, home was not home. He had to fight for his new home and regain it. So that's the kind of the metaphor there.
You know, it's interesting. We just last week we had some couple of guests on the show. In fact, they put on an event yesterday at the N-Wave Theater down in Harbourfront, and it was all about the same theme, the theme of what is home. Mm-hmm. And they're from Iran originally, and now they're here in Canada. And you know, their whole project is all about meditations on, you know, what does home mean? What does it mean to be home? Where is home for anybody?
In home, in my conclusion, is that home is really a state of mind. You know, it's a collection of all the things you've done in your life, things you're able to assemble back and surround yourself with, and that becomes home. You know, and that can change, right? Home is never a permanent place. You know, that business of living happily ever after is fiction, right?
When will that change?
When will that change?
When will it not be fiction any longer, and we can actually all live happily ever after?
I don't know. I don't think that's the fate of humankind. You know, I think we are constantly destined to keep, you know, journeying. You know, and then it's the journey is the purpose of life, I guess, on Earth. The arrival is when it's done.
Yeah.
When you leave.
So, so tell us a little bit more about this journey that you're. Who's the principal character in this book?
His name is Martin James. He's a Sri Lankan burgher. Now the burghers are a minority, a leftover fragment from colonialization, right? So Ceylon was a Portuguese colony for 150 years, and a Dutch colony for another 150 years, and then a British colony for another 150 years. And so 450 years of colonialism left some European remnants in the country. They got independence in 1948, and then things started to change around the 60s when, you know, the language laws were becoming more restrictive, and people had to study the local language, which is Sinhala. And a lot of people who had been on the margins, the minorities, who had studied in English or were Christians or what have you, started to leave the country. You know, a lot of them emigrated to Australia, to England. Some came to Canada. And so this whole business of departures started to take place. In Martin's case, of course, he couldn't go anywhere because his parents, you know, his mother was mentally ill, and his father was a bit of a drunkard, and he couldn't get past to go anywhere. So he had to make his own way, and he capitalizes on the ethnic troubles that took place in 1983, you know, when the Tamils and the Sinhalese were fighting. And he kind of jumped ship and smuggles himself into Canada. Now, I'm not going to go beyond that point, but that's the baggage with which he comes to this country. And then he has to try and make it his home, which he does. I mean, he's quite successful. As I said, he starts and ends companies. He gets married to a very rich woman. But the certain things don't escape. You think you leave the old country and you leave the baggage behind. So he escaped alcoholism and he escaped mental illness. When he comes here, his wife, who he's married, this rich woman, ends up mentally disturbed. And he himself ends up an alcoholic. So the moral of the story is you can't really run away from some of these things that you come along with, and you have to come to terms with them rather than try to run away from them. So that's what happens. So he's constantly trying to come to terms with these demons that keep following him.
That's kind of interesting because you mentioned running away. Well, one of the things we often run away from is we run away from home, right? So here he's running away from one home and he's finding the same problems in another home.
Exactly. The moral of the story, obviously, is that the grass is not greener on the other side. It's just different grass.
But they keep telling us it is, or it looks greener. So, I mean, what does that mean for us? Maybe we should stay where we are.
Yeah, I mean, I went back after 21 years and I met a lot of my old friends who were back in the old country. And some of them had done extremely well. They'd roll with the punches. Some of them hadn't really done well, but quite a number of them had done extremely well. And you could argue that, had you stayed, or had you left, self-realization is the thing that you're finally aiming for. Whether you leave or whether you have to, you stay in the same place. And in fact, in this book, there is a bit of that reconciliation because he does face up to people like his mother, for instance, who never left, and his father who never left. But they also reach some level of, self-enlightenment through being in the one place, whereas he had to travel all over the place to try and get there. And there's an argument to be made that you could probably stay in the same place. Your kind of mental horizon may not broaden, but your internal life may still deepen if you're introspective and reflective on the things that are happening to you. Plus, in that country, with all the violence and all the disruption that took place, it's a very fertile ground for self-reflection. You keep wondering, my God, what's happening here? Why are these people being killed? And it does provide, I guess, the fuel for introspection.
Now, you mentioned to some extent this book is autobiographical.
Well, I'm trying to say that it is not. I want to say it is not because, for instance, Martin James is not me. I make that very clear up front. It's a work of fiction, but it's based on historical incidents that took place during a certain time period in which I was growing up. So the backdrop is real. The characters are fictitious. And it would have been unfair for me to have written an autobiography because, first of all, I don't think anyone would have been interested. And you tend to upset a lot of people when you write autobiographies because some people are represented well and some people are not represented well. This book takes everything that happened and all the people and incidents that we faced and mixes it all up, right? And so the people you see in these books are kind of amalgams of perhaps 5 or 6 real people. And in that way, you get more freedom to roam as a fiction writer because you can tell a story in the way you want to tell it, not the way in which it happened. So yes, I do agree that there are certain incidents, certain historical incidents that are true, and you can't make up history. History has already happened. So against this backdrop, these characters, who are fictional characters, play out.
Now, it mentions on the book here that Martin James, who's the protagonist of the book, is a true Canadian.
Yes.
What does that mean to you? What's a true Canadian?
It's a good question because I remember when my younger son was in grade 5 or 6, one of those grades. They have this thing in school where they have to go to, the teacher asks the students to say, okay, who are you, where are you from, where are your parents from? And so that, kids were getting up and saying, well, I'm you know, I'm Canadian, my parents are Indian, or I'm Canadian, my parents are Italian, and it's a fairly easy connection to make. Well, my son was, you know, born in the Middle East. His parents were Sri Lankan, of Dutch origin, living in Canada, and, you know, he was really confused. So he gets up and says, I don't know, I'm like mixed up or something. And he comes home very frustrated and he tells me, he says, Dad, what am I? And I said to him, you know, I think you're a real Canadian. Because, you know, you embody a lot of the influences that are out in the world that have now all come to Canada and have all tried to make this their home. So I guess why I called him a true Canadian is that he has left somewhere. I mean, we've all at some point, whether it's 4 or 5 generations back, have left somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So his first generation, what he's left is very vivid in his mind. He's left somewhere, he's come here, and he's committed to making a life here. He's not saying, you know, oh, home is always where I came from. He's trying to make a life here. He tries his damnedest. He succeeds and he fails. And then he goes back thinking, maybe I should check out the old place to see whether it's still home. And he finds it is not.
Mm-hmm.
And then he makes a true commitment to come back. He accepts all his sins, and there's a few sins that he's left behind. You know, he's got some illegitimate children and some broken relationships, and he's got a whole bunch of, you know, things that he's got to fix. He's got a son who's seeing a shrink. You know, he's got a few things he can't run away from those. And he accepts them all, embraces them all, and says, this is my home, and I'm committed to it. So I think in that sense, you know, I came here as an immigrant when I was in my early 30s. I had 2 young children. You know, I had left a good job. I came and I went looking for a job, and they said, well, you don't have any Canadian experience. I said, well, I have a degree, and I have, you know, I worked in the travel business, which is where I was at the time. And the best job I got was in a back room doing some, you know, some stripping of tickets and stuffing envelopes and things like that. But I moved. I still said, you know, I'm not running back. I came here. This is what I got. I've got to now take it from here and go somewhere else. And I did. And you know, my career progressed. I moved into some fairly senior positions in my career. And then I also made choices to say, okay, now I have to do other things. So I think that that's the Canadian way. It's a good way.